Montana Territory, autumn 1887. Samuel Garrett was a 42-year-old former copper miner from Butte who had spent a decade tunneling through rock 1,000 feet below the surface. He could not shake what he had learned underground. The temperature stabilizes with depth. The deeper you go, the more constant the earth becomes. 8 feet down, the ground holds at 50 to 55 degrees year-round, winter or summer, blizzard or drought. That autumn, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cordwood, Samuel started digging beneath his barn floor. Master builder Jonas Milright watched from the fence line one afternoon, shook his head, and called out, "You're wasting your time, Garrett. Dirt don't keep you warm." The question was not whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The question was whether Samuel could finish before winter arrived, and whether his family would freeze while he gambled on a theory. Samuel had a wife, Catherine, and 2 children, Margaret, age 9, and Raymond, age 6. They had been in the territory for 3 years. The first winter, they had nearly lost Raymond to pneumonia. The second winter, the Ketchum family just 2 miles south had frozen in their cabin when their chimney collapsed during a blizzard. Samuel had helped carry the bodies out in March when the snow finally melted. The problem was not the cabins themselves. Log construction was sound. The problem was the wind. Montana wind did not stop. It found every gap, every chink, every seam. It pulled heat out through convection faster than any stove could replace it. Families burned cord after cord of wood and still woke to frost on the inside walls. Samuel understood something his neighbors did not. Still air insulates. Moving air steals heat. Underground, there is no wind. The earth itself becomes a blanket. He dug for 6 weeks. The excavation was 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. He lined the walls with fieldstone he hauled from the creek bed, dry stacking them without mortar, leaving small gaps for airflow. He built a timber ceiling using 8-inch beams salvaged from an abandoned claim shack, then covered the beams with split planks. Over the planks, he piled 2 feet of earth back on top, then rebuilt the barn floor above it all. The entrance was a trapdoor in the barn floor, with a wooden ladder leading down. He installed a small cast-iron stove in one corner, venting it through a 4-inch pipe that rose up through the barn and out the roof. He built 2 narrow sleeping platforms along one wall. The ceiling was just high enough for him to stand upright. The whole structure cost him almost nothing. The stone was free. The timber was salvaged. The stove was a hand-me-down from a family that had moved to Spokane. He spent $14 on the chimney pipe and the trapdoor hinges. Jonas Milright came by again in early November, this time with 2 other builders from the settlement. They stood in the barn and looked down through the open trapdoor. "You planning to live like a prairie dog?" one of them asked. "It'll be a tomb," Jonas said. "No light, no air. Damp'll kill you before the cold does." Samuel did not argue. He just kept working. He sealed the gaps around the trapdoor with wool strips. He built a small shelf for lanterns. He moved 2 months of food supplies down into the chamber: sacks of flour, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods. Catherine did not say much, but Samuel could see the doubt in her face. Margaret asked why they had to sleep underground like animals. Raymond cried the first time Samuel made him climb down the ladder. The settlement had about 30 families that winter. Most lived in single-room log cabins with a fireplace or stove at one end. The wealthier families had two-room cabins with a central chimney. Everyone burned wood. A typical family went through a cord every 10 days in deep winter. That meant constant cutting, constant hauling, constant feeding the fire. The conventional wisdom was simple: build thick log walls, chink every gap with mud and moss, keep a big fire going, and hope the chimney did not catch fire or collapse. It worked well enough in moderate cold, but when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind picked up, even the best cabins became barely livable. Families slept in their coats. Water buckets froze solid overnight. Bread dough would not rise. Samuel had spent 10 years underground in the mines. He knew that at 8 feet depth, the rock stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. The earth was a massive heat sink. It absorbed temperature slowly and released it slowly. If you could tap into that stability, you could bypass the whole problem of fighting the wind and the cold. The science was straightforward. Air is a poor conductor of heat. Still air trapped in small pockets insulates effectively. Moving air, however, strips heat away through convection. A log cabin, no matter how well chinked, always had some airflow. Gaps around doors and windows. Drafts from the chimney. Tiny cracks between logs that expanded and contracted with humidity changes. All of that allowed convective heat loss. Underground, there was no wind. The stone walls absorbed heat from the stove during the day and radiated it back slowly at night. The 2 feet of earth above the chamber acted as insulation. The whole system was simple, quiet, and required only a small fire to stay comfortable. It was not magic. It was wind control and thermal mass. But nobody in the valley had ever thought to try it. By mid-November, the family was sleeping underground. Samuel kept the trapdoor propped open during the day to let light and air circulate. At night, he closed it and kept a small fire going in the stove. The chamber stayed in the low 60s even when the outside temperature dropped into the 20s. Catherine admitted it was warmer than the cabin had ever been. Margaret stopped complaining once she realized she could sleep without her coat. Raymond liked the adventure of climbing down the ladder every night. But the real test had not come yet. December started mild. Light snow. Temperatures in the teens and 20s. The settlement went about its business. Samuel used about a quarter cord of wood that month. His neighbors were already burning through their second and third cords. Then January showed up. The cold front moved in on January 7th. The temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. By January 10th, it was minus 25. By January 13th, it was minus 35. The wind howled out of the north at 20 to 30 miles per hour, driving the wind chill down to minus 50 and below. The valley locked down. Families huddled inside. Wood piles shrank rapidly. The Hendersons, a quarter-mile east, burned through a cord and a half in 5 days. The Pritchards, half a mile west, started burning furniture on the 4th day when their woodpile ran out. Jonas Milright's 2-room cabin had a massive fieldstone fireplace that he was proud of. He kept it roaring day and night. But the wind found every crack. The temperature inside his cabin never got above 45 degrees. His wife and children slept in layers of wool blankets and coats. Frost formed on the inside walls. Bread froze solid on the table overnight. On January 14th, Jonas walked over to Samuel's barn. He had not spoken to Samuel since November. He climbed through the snowdrifts, opened the barn door, and stood there in the cold, looking at the trapdoor in the floor. Samuel heard the barn door open. He climbed the ladder and pushed the trapdoor up. Warm air poured out into the freezing barn. Jonas stared. "How warm is it down there?" Jonas asked. 67 degrees, Samuel said. "Maybe 68. Jonas did not believe him. "That's not possible. Come down and see." Jonas climbed down the ladder. The warmth hit him immediately. The air was still, dry, comfortable. Catherine was sitting at a small table with the children, mending a coat by lantern light. The stove had a small fire, barely more than coals. There were only a few pieces of firewood stacked beside it. Jonas stood there in his heavy coat and felt sweat start on his forehead. "How much wood are you burning?" Jonas asked. "Maybe 2 pieces every 3 hours, Samuel said. "Less at night." Jonas did the math in his head. A cord of wood was 128 cubic feet. A typical piece of split firewood was about 16 inches long and 4 inches by 4 inches in cross-section. That was roughly 0.15 cubic feet per piece. 2 pieces every 3 hours was 16 pieces a day, or about 2.4 cubic feet. A cord would last Samuel 53 days at that rate. Jonas was burning a cord every 6 days. Samuel was using less than a fifth of the wood Jonas was. "How?" Jonas asked. Samuel explained the principle. 8 feet down, the earth stayed at 55 degrees year-round. The stone walls absorbed heat from the stove during the day and radiated it back at night. The 2 feet of earth above the chamber insulated against the outside cold. There was no wind underground, so no convective heat loss. The chamber was small, so the stove did not have to heat a large volume of air. The whole system was efficient, stable, and required minimal fuel. Jonas stood there for a long time, just feeling the warmth. "I called you a fool," Jonas said quietly. "You did. I was wrong." By January 16th, word had spread. 3 other families came to see Samuel's underground chamber. The Hendersons, the Pritchards, a young couple named the Carters, who had nearly frozen the first night of the cold snap. They all climbed down the ladder. They all felt the warmth. They all asked the same questions. How deep? What kind of stone? How much wood? The cold snap lasted until January 22nd. 14 days of -30 to -42 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills well below -50. It was the worst cold anyone in the valley had ever experienced. 2 families lost livestock. 1 family abandoned their cabin and moved in with relatives in town. The Hendersons burned their front porch to stay warm. The Pritchards burned their kitchen table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame. Samuel used half a cord of wood for the entire 2 weeks. His family stayed warm, dry, and comfortable. The children played quiet games by lantern light. Catherine baked bread in a small Dutch oven on the stove. Raymond stopped crying about sleeping underground and started calling it the fort. When the cold finally broke on January 23rd, the temperature rose to -5 degrees. It felt like a heat wave. Jonas Milright came back to Samuel's barn 3 days later. This time he brought a notebook and a pencil. "I need to know everything," Jonas said. "Dimensions, depth, stone thickness, ventilation. I've got 4 families asking me to build them the same thing." Samuel walked him through the entire design. 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, 10 feet deep. Fieldstone walls dry stacked 18 inches thick. Timber ceiling with 8-inch beams. 2 feet of earth on top for insulation. 4-inch chimney pipe vented through the barn or cabin above. Small stove, no bigger than necessary. Trapdoor entrance with wool strip ceiling. How long to build? Jonas asked. 6 weeks if you work steady, Samuel said. 4 if you've got help. Jonas wrote it all down. Then he looked up at Samuel. I told half the valley you were crazy, Jonas said. I'm going to tell the other half they should copy you. By summer 1888, 7 families had dug underground chambers. Jonas Milright built 3 of them himself, charging only for materials and a modest labor fee. The Hendersons dug theirs beneath their cabin floor. The Pritchards built theirs under their barn, just like Samuel. The Carters, newly married and with little money, dug a simple version with log walls instead of stone, and a canvas tarp roof under the earth. But it still worked. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was not as severe as the previous one, but it was still brutal by any measure. Temperatures dropped into the -20s for weeks at a time. Wind chills regularly hit -40. But the families with underground chambers stayed warm. They used a fraction of the firewood their neighbors burned. Their children slept comfortably. Their wives did not have to wear coats indoors. Jonas Milright became an advocate. He drew up plans. He helped families calculate costs. He supervised construction. He admitted publicly that he had been wrong, and that Samuel Garrett had taught him something after a lifetime of building. Samuel himself said little. He had not built the chamber to prove a point. He had built it to keep his family alive. The fact that it worked, and that others copied it, was simply a practical outcome. But the valley remembered. The underground chambers had a lifespan that outlasted the families who built them. By the early 1900s, most were still in use, though some had been expanded or improved. The Hendersons added a second room to theirs in 1895. The Pritchards reinforced their ceiling beams in 1897, after a heavy snow load caused some cracking. But by the 1920s, things began to change. The railroad brought coal and better stoves. Lumber became cheaper. Construction methods improved. Above-ground cabins with better insulation and modern heating became the norm. The underground chambers, once seen as ingenious, started to seem primitive. By the 1930s, most of the original chambers were abandoned. Families filled them in or converted them to root cellars. A few were left intact but unused, accessed only occasionally for storage. The knowledge of how to build them and why they worked began to fade. Samuel Garrett died in 1923 at the age of 78. He had lived in Montana for 36 years. His underground chamber beneath the barn remained functional until 1931, when his son Raymond, by then 49 years old, sold the property and moved to Missoula. The new owner filled in the chamber and tore down the barn to build a larger structure. Jonas Milright outlived Samuel by 2 years, dying in 1925 at the age of 81. In his final interview with a local historian in 1924, Jonas was asked about the most important thing he had learned in 50 years of building. I learned that a man digging dirt can be smarter than a master builder with 3 decades of experience, Jonas said. And I learned to listen before I call someone a fool. The historian wrote it down, but the interview was never widely circulated. It remained in a file at the County Historical Society in Great Falls, read by a handful of researchers over the decades, but never reaching a broader audience. By the 1950s, None of the original underground chambers were still in use as living spaces. A few remained as root cellars. Most had been filled in and forgotten. The families who had built them were gone. The children who had slept in them were old or dead. The valley moved on. In 1978, a graduate student at the University of Montana, researching frontier survival strategies, came across Jonas Milright's 1924 interview in the county archives. She followed the lead and found property records showing 7 families in the Silver Creek area had built underground structures between 1887 and 1890. She interviewed descendants, searched for physical evidence, and wrote a thesis titled Subterranean Thermal Shelters in Late 19th Century Montana. The thesis documented the construction methods, the physics principles involved, and the social dynamics of knowledge transfer from Samuel Garrett to the broader community. It noted the efficiency gains. Families using underground chambers burned 60 to 80% less firewood than their neighbors in conventional cabins during extreme cold. It documented the temperature differentials. Interior temperatures consistently 20 to 30 degrees warmer than above-ground structures, when outside temperatures dropped below zero. But the thesis was read by a few dozen academics and filed away in the university library. It did not change building practices. It did not influence modern construction. It remained a historical curiosity, a footnote about frontier ingenuity that had been rendered obsolete by central heating and insulation technology. And yet the principle remains sound. Earth temperature stabilizes at depth. Thermal mass stores and releases heat slowly. Wind is the enemy of warmth, and still air insulates. These are not historical curiosities. They are physical laws. Samuel Garrett understood them because he had spent a decade underground. He built a shelter that worked because he trusted what he knew, not what the master builder told him. He saved his family, and then he saved 7 others. And for a brief window of time, the valley learned something that most of the country never knew. Then the knowledge faded, as knowledge often does when convenience replaces necessity. Before attempting any underground construction or building project, especially one involving excavation, structural loads, or ventilation systems, consult with licensed professional engineers, architects, and local building authorities. Historical techniques depicted here are not substitutes for modern engineering standards, building codes, or safety regulations. What worked in 1887 may not meet current requirements, and improper construction can lead to structural failure, carbon monoxide buildup, moisture damage, or other serious hazards. Always prioritize safety and legality over historical recreation. Samuel Garrett's chamber stayed warm because he controlled wind and used thermal mass. Jonas Milright. The second winter tested the design in a different way. The cold snap of January 1888 had been brief and brutal. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was long and grinding. Temperatures stayed below zero for 5 straight weeks. Snow fell almost continuously from late November through February. The drifts reached the eaves of cabins. Trails between homesteads disappeared. The families with underground chambers faced a challenge Samuel had not anticipated. Wood supply. Not the amount of wood needed, but access to it. When snow buried the landscape and temperatures stayed at -20 for weeks, going outside to fetch firewood became dangerous. Even a short trip to an outdoor woodpile could result in frostbite. Children could not do it safely. Even adults risked exposure. Samuel had thought ahead. He had stacked 2 months of firewood inside the barn, above the underground chamber. He could drop down through the trapdoor push up a second smaller hatch he had cut near the woodpile, and pull down an armload without ever going outside. The Hendersons had not planned as carefully. Their woodpile was 30 feet from their cabin. By mid-January, the snow was chest deep. Every trip for wood was an ordeal. They started rationing, letting the temperature in their underground chamber drop into the 50s at night to conserve fuel. Samuel walked over to their place in early February. It took him an hour to cover half a mile. When he climbed down into their chamber, he found the whole family huddled around a tiny fire. The temperature was maybe 55 degrees, comfortable compared to outside, but cold enough that they still wore coats indoors. "You need to move your woodpile closer," Samuel said. "Can't move it in this snow," Henderson replied. "Can't even see where the pile is anymore." Samuel thought about it. "Dig a snow tunnel from your cabin door to the woodpile. Pack the walls hard. Roof it with planks if you can find any. You'll still be outside, but you'll be out of the wind." Henderson looked skeptical, but desperate. The next day, he started digging. It took him 3 days to tunnel 15 feet. His 2 older boys helped. They packed the snow walls until they were solid as ice. They did not have planks for a roof, so they left it open to the sky, but kept the tunnel narrow enough that drifting was minimal. It worked. The tunnel blocked the wind. The family could reach the woodpile without fighting through open drifts. The temperature in their chamber came back up to the mid-60s. By late February, 4 other families had dug similar tunnels, not just to woodpiles, but between buildings. The Pritchards tunneled from their cabin to their barn. The Carters tunneled from their cabin to their root cellar. The valley was learning, adapting, solving problems as they appeared. Jonas Milright documented all of it. He had started keeping detailed notes after the first winter. By March 1889, he had filled 2 notebooks with sketches, measurements, observations, and modifications. He noted that chambers with stone walls stayed warmer than those with log walls. He noted that chambers with earth roofs thicker than 18 inches stayed warmer than those with thinner roofs. He noted that proper ventilation was critical to prevent condensation and carbon monoxide buildup. He also noted something unexpected. The families who lived underground during the winter reported fewer respiratory illnesses, fewer colds, less coughing. At first, Jonas thought it was coincidence. But by the 3rd winter, the pattern was consistent. Samuel had a theory. The air down there is still and clean. No drafts bringing in dust and smoke. No constant temperature swings stressing the body. You stay warm and stable. Your body is not fighting to stay alive every minute. It made sense. Above-ground cabins, even well-built ones, had constant airflow, smoke from the fire, drafts from doors and windows, temperature fluctuations throughout the day and night. The body had to work constantly to regulate temperature. Underground, the environment was stable. The body could rest. Jonas wrote it down, though he had no way to prove it scientifically. It was observation, not data. But the observation was consistent. The winter of 1889 to 1890 brought a new challenge. A young family named the Daltons built an underground chamber in late autumn, following Jonas Milright's plans exactly. They moved in when the first snows came. 2 weeks later, they climbed back out and refused to go down again. "It's too dark," Mrs. Dalton said. "I can't stand it. I feel like I'm suffocating." Samuel went to see them. He climbed down into their chamber. It was built correctly. Stone walls, timber ceiling, good ventilation, but it was oppressively dim. The Daltons had only one small lantern, and they were rationing lamp oil. The chamber felt like a cave. "You need more light," Samuel said. "And you need tasks. Handwork, mending, carving, reading if you have books. Sitting in the dark with nothing to do will drive you out of your mind." He brought them 2 extra lanterns and a gallon of lamp oil. He brought Catherine over to teach Mrs. Dalton how to make soap and candles during the long evenings. He brought a small portable loom that Margaret had outgrown and showed Mrs. Dalton how to weave simple cloth from wool scraps. It helped. The Daltons stayed underground the rest of the winter. Mrs. Dalton later admitted that the darkness had been harder than the cold ever was. "But once I had enough light and something to keep my hands busy, it was tolerable." Jonas added a section to his notes about psychological factors. Light, tasks, routine. The physical design could be perfect, but if the occupants felt trapped or idle, they would abandon the space. The underground chambers were not just about warmth. They were about creating a livable environment for months at a time. By 1892, there were 14 underground chambers in use across the valley. Some were beneath barns, some beneath cabins. Some were standalone structures with earth-bermed walls and sod roofs. The designs varied, but the principle was the same. Get below the wind, use thermal mass, minimize fuel. The community had developed a shared knowledge base. Families helped each other dig. Jonas Milright offered free consultations. Samuel Garrett became a quiet reference point, the man who had started it all. He did not seek attention, but people came to him with questions. How deep should the ventilation pipe be? How thick should the stone walls be? How much firewood was really needed? He answered every question with the same practical tone he had always used. No speeches, no philosophy, just numbers and observations. The winter of 1893 to 1894 was the mildest in a decade. Temperatures rarely dropped below 0. Snow was light. Families burned less wood than ever. Some questioned whether the underground chambers were still necessary. But the next winter, 1894 to 1895, brought another brutal cold snap. Minus 35 degrees for 10 days straight. The families with chambers stayed warm. The families without them struggled. 2 new families dug chambers that spring. The cycle repeated. Mild winters made people forget. Harsh winters reminded them. The chambers remained in use, but they never spread beyond the immediate valley. Travelers passing through saw the chimney pipes rising from barn floors or earth mounds and thought it was strange, but said nothing. The knowledge stayed local. Samuel's children grew up. Margaret married a rancher's son in 1896 and moved 20 miles south. She and her husband built a conventional cabin. She never built an underground chamber, though she told her children stories about sleeping in the fort when she was young. Raymond stayed closer. He worked with his father on the property through his 20s. He understood the chambers intellectually, but he never shared his father's conviction. When he married in 1905, he built a modern cabin with a cast iron stove and factory-milled lumber. It was warmer than the old log cabins had been, and it did not require digging a hole in the ground. Catherine Garrett died in 1911 at the age of 64. Samuel continued living in the original homestead, though by then he spent winters in the cabin above ground. The underground chamber was still functional, but he was 76 years old, and climbing the ladder was difficult. He used the chamber mostly for storage. Jonas Milright's children scattered. None of them became builders. His eldest son moved to Helena and worked as a clerk. His daughter married and moved to Spokane. His youngest son enlisted in the army and was killed in France in 1918. Jonas mourned alone in a valley that had begun to empty. The population of the Silver Creek area peaked around 1910 and then slowly declined. Young people moved to cities. Farms consolidated. The railroad brought goods that made remote homesteading less necessary. By 1920, half the families who had been there in 1890 were gone. The underground chambers that remained were used less and less. Some families converted them to root cellars, which was practical. Some filled them in, which was easier than maintaining them. A few remained intact, but unused, slowly deteriorating as timber rotted and stone shifted. Samuel Garrett spent his final years quietly. He was respected, but not celebrated. He had solved a problem in 1887, and the solution had worked. That was enough for him. He did not write about it. He did not give speeches. He answered questions when asked, and otherwise kept to himself. He died in February 1923, during a cold snap that would have tested his chamber one more time. He was buried in the Silver Creek Cemetery next to Catherine. The funeral was attended by about 20 people, most of them old, most of them remembering winters they had survived decades earlier. Jonas Milright spoke briefly at the service. Samuel Garrett taught me that experience matters more than credentials. He was right when I was wrong. I never forgot that. The valley moved on. By 1930, only 4 of the original underground chambers were still in occasional use. By 1940, none were. The last one was filled in sometime in the late 1940s, when a returning veteran bought the property and wanted a clean foundation for a new barn. The graduate student who discovered the story in 1978 tried to find physical evidence. She drove to the Silver Creek area with a metal detector and ground-penetrating radar borrowed from the geology department. She found 3 sites where underground chambers had likely existed. All had been filled in. 2 showed faint depressions in the ground. 1 showed a scatter of fieldstone that might have been wall remnants. She photographed what she could find. She measured the depressions. She collected a few stones. But there was nothing substantial left. No intact structures. No preserved timbers. Just faint traces in the earth, and mentions in a few old property records. Her thesis included a chapter on why the technique had disappeared. The reasons were straightforward. Modern insulation made above-ground structures nearly as efficient. Central heating eliminated the need for constant fire tending. Rural electrification brought lights and appliances that made underground living impractical. And perhaps most importantly, cultural expectations changed. By the 1930s, living underground was seen as backward, even desperate. Nobody wanted to be the family in the hole, while their neighbors had modern homes. The thesis concluded with a brief reflection on lost knowledge. The author noted that Samuel Garrett's chamber had achieved an efficiency that modern green building techniques were only beginning to match in the 1970s. Passive earth temperature regulation. Minimal energy input. Natural thermal mass storage. These were not primitive methods. They were sophisticated applications of basic physics. But the knowledge had been lost because it was local, oral, and situational. It worked for a specific time, a specific place, and a specific set of conditions. When those conditions changed, the knowledge became irrelevant. No one wrote textbooks about digging chambers beneath barn floors. No engineering schools taught the optimal depth for earth-sheltered structures in Montana wind conditions. The knowledge existed in Jonas Milright's notebooks, which were lost when his house burned in 1919. It existed in the memories of the families who had used the chambers, and those memories died with them. Subscribe if you want more stories about the practical innovations that kept frontier families alive, the ones that worked but were forgotten when convenience replaced necessity. The story of Samuel Garrett's underground chamber is not unique. Across the American frontier, people solved problems using whatever knowledge they had and whatever materials were available. Most of those solutions were never documented. They worked, they were used, and then they were forgotten when something easier came along. What makes Samuel's story worth remembering is not that he was exceptional. It is that he was practical. He took what he knew from 10 years underground in the mines and applied it to a different problem. He did not invent new physics. He just used old physics in a new context. And when people mocked him, he kept working. When they doubted him, he proved them wrong with numbers. When they asked him how, he showed them. That is the pattern of innovation that matters, not the dramatic breakthroughs, not the celebrated inventors, but the quiet problem solvers who see a need, trust what they know, and build something that works. The Valley learned from Samuel Garrett for about 30 years. Then the Valley forgot. But the principle remains. The earth holds temperature. Still air insulates. Wind steals heat. These truths do not change just because we have central heating and insulation baths. Samuel Garrett stayed at 68 degrees, while the Valley dropped to -42. He used a fifth of the wood his neighbors burned. He kept his children warm when others were burning furniture to survive. And then the knowledge faded, as most practical knowledge does, replaced by something more convenient, but not necessarily more elegant. Jonas Milright admitted he was wrong. That admission mattered more than the chamber itself. It meant that experience could challenge authority, that a miner could teach a master builder, that the Valley could learn something new, even if it seemed strange at first. The chambers are gone now. The people who built them are gone. The Valley has moved on. But the story remains, buried in a thesis that a few dozen people read, waiting for someone to care enough to dig it up and ask the question, what else did we forget that we might need to remember? Comment below where you are watching from, and whether winter where you live has ever made you reconsider what warmth really requires. The end.